about it on social media and you're like, wow, what does that mean for me? This is our solution to that. It's so difficult to, in a social media post, say, this is what this means to you, just based on your rising sign or just based on your sun sign. So we put out the call, we asked people, send us your questions, and we chose the one that had a lot going on that was relevant to the current time that a lot of people could also relate to. And today we will be sharing that chart anonymously and going through some of the basic questions that that person asked us and just really sharing what we would look at and kind of doing a little bit live what the process is of diving into the chart and finding those answers. And we're also going to share in general some stuff about your Saturn return. If you're leaving it, if you're coming into it, if you're in your first one, your second one, or maybe even your third, some things to expect and ways to prepare.
By the way, if anyone's going through their third Saturn return, I think
congratulations.
And we will automatically read your chart.
Yeah. All right. Here we are.
We are live.
We did it.
We did it. Crystalline.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
TV.
You froze for a moment. This is a really great one.
And to the person who's already joined us, hello. Great to see you as well.
Hello. This is our very, very first episode of Ask Me Astros, and it's a little different than IG Live because IG Live, we're like seeing our audience, and today we're just in this room on our computers with each other.
Yeah, there is the option to chat and engage with us on most streaming options. I'm guessing the one that probably doesn't have it is going to be hello, it's Jill. Yes. So we do have some ways to be able to connect with people. So this is great.
Fantastic. Well, I'm Stevie Henriette of Art of the Zodiac, and you're the real Crystalline.
I am the real Crystalline. Yes.
There are imposters. Beware.
There are. I will never DM you for readings. But anyway, I am Crystalline Vitovich. I'm the storytelling astrologer, and I love to dive into charts, particularly with CV, and pull the story out and see what the charts are saying and how you can help someone really be their own hero of the hero's journey that is the chart.
Absolutely. And so this is the very first episode of something we call Ask Me Astros. And the idea is that every month we ask people to submit their questions and their natal charts so that we can take a deep dive into a topic that hopefully has relevance to many people. And in each of these episodes, we will be kind of taking you through piece by piece how to read a chart. So if this is something that's new to you, we're kind of sharing our processes with you. And that is a dog coughing up something in the background.
It's in there.
And yeah, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about the chart we're going today's episode?
Yeah, so what we do is we put out a call for questions that you can actually send your questions about your chart and specifically like what is coming up for you in the near future. A lot of people have been hearing about Saturn moving into Pisces. So we get a lot of questions about Saturn right now, maybe about Pluto moving into Aquarius. If you hear about it on social media and you're like, wow, what does that mean for me? This is our solution to that. It's so difficult to, in a social media post, say, this is what this means to you, just based on your rising sign or just based on your sun sign. So we put out the call, we asked people, send us your questions, and we chose the one that had a lot going on that was relevant to the current time that a lot of people could also relate to. And today we will be sharing that chart anonymously and going through some of the basic questions that that person asked us and just really sharing what we would look at and kind of doing a little bit live what the process is of diving into the chart and finding those answers. And we're also going to share in general some stuff about your Saturn return. If you're leaving it, if you're coming into it, if you're in your first one, your second one, or maybe even your third, some things to expect and ways to prepare.
By the way, if anyone's going through their third Saturn return, I think
congratulations.
And we will automatically read your chart.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair statement.
Yep.
So shall we get going with the chart today?
Yeah, let's bring the chart in as kind of like our special guest today. Here is the chart. So basics of this chart, right? We have a Leo rising. We have an Aries sun, which is exalted, and that's kind of lovely. And we also have an exalted moon up in the midheaven. So lots of kind of really cool things that if I'm looking at this chart right away, I'm thinking this person has got some really great things going for them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of
Yeah.
planets. There's a lot of planets at home, a lot of
Mhm.
planets having really vibrant conversations, right? Like, I'm just staring at that sun in its joy in the ninth
Mhm.
house with Mercury, which is also the ascendant ruler,
Yep.
and that like
Um,
Jupiter in the first house.
Yeah, the sun is the
Oh,
ascendant.
the sun's not the ascendant ruler. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, I'm a liar,
yeah.
total liar. But
Yep, Jupiter in the first house is a big deal. The one thing I'm looking at on this chart when I have like a second blush is, of
yeah,
course, you look at, is this a day chart or a night chart? This is clearly a day chart. The sun is above the horizon, which means I want to find out what Mars is up to, since
yeah.
Mars would be kind of the bully of the chart, the one who poses the most challenge. And then we do find that Mars is, I believe Mars is in his own terms, just barely is in his own terms, but is in the sign of his fall and is in the 12th house. So he's strong, but he's probably not feeling quite comfortable or at home. And that's going to influence some things going on for the person who owns this chart.
I think you kind of set up something that's really important in a way that we both read charts is to think about the planets as all of them, like they all have jobs. And
Hmm.
we want to think, are they able to do that job?
Yep.
Like, what is their capacity? Are they happy to do that job?
Yeah.
And like, what do the responsibilities of that job entail? So that Mars that we're talking about,
Hmm.
which maybe can be a bit of a bully, and it's a house it maybe doesn't want to be in. It's in a sign where, right, like it's not really comfortable. And it's in charge of both the sun and the fourth house of home. So that's
Hmm.
something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you think about it, you look at the planet and you think, well, what does this planet do?
Hmm.
Mars is your ambition, can be fighting, can be directness, and can be quite the intuitive creative in his own right. Will be bravery and courage and things like that. Now, Mars in the 12th and in Cancer, how much access does the native have to that? That's a different story. So in the 12th house, it's hard for the native to really bring that up on purpose. It might come out when needed as like an unconscious kind of action. It might be something that sneaks up on the native. By the way, the native is the person who owns the chart or who embodies the chart.
Yeah.
And so Mars may be like, when you push this person too far, you get to meet their Mars. Until then, you may not know Mars is chilling there. I do think it's really interesting where Mars governs the sun and the fourth house, the moon governs Mars. So it's pretty interesting with that. And Mars, we look at like, is anybody else in the chart helping Mars by saying, hey, buddy, I know you're having a hard day. Let me lend a hand here. And we do see that the moon is sending a little opportunity for assistance with that sextile. However, the sun is square. So, like, I see you, not really lending a hand, but if something goes wrong, I'll let you know. Um, and then we have the trine with the IC that Mars rules by sign anyway.
Yeah, and I think something you to add to this conversation, by the way, that exalted moon
Hmm.
giving help to Mars
Yeah.
is a really nice touch, especially
Yes.
because as a yeah, I was about to confuse my sect for a minute. Something I want to add on to that about that Mars, and I think this is interesting, a conversation that we had before, is that planets that are either in, let's see, their fall or
Mhm.
detriment,
Mhm.
right? Like you referring to them as like counterculture once?
I was referring to planets that are debilitated in the chart. Don't necessarily mean you're down on your luck or down and out and have no opportunity.
Yeah,
It was Gemini Brett who once suggested to my poor debilitated Venus
yeah.
that perhaps the things Venus rules, relationships and things like that, beauty and aesthetic, I might not do it the way culture governs it. I would do it counterculture or in a diverse way. So the way that this person might do Mars things might be different than what we see portrayed in culture.
Yeah, I think that's really important because sometimes like we're doing this live, people watching us may not like have a whole lot of astrology experience and we're like this Mars is having a troubled time. I think it's
Mhm.
important to remember that a lot of difficult signatures in a chart by the time you're actually sitting with a client,
Mhm.
they maybe have experienced some of the challenges of dealing with a planet that maybe has a hard time expressing itself for
Mhm.
various reasons. But oftentimes that I've noticed in my consultations, that they've learned many times they've learned to work with that planet in really interesting ways,
Mhm.
which is something to sort of keep in mind here.
Yeah.
They become like superpowers, if you will.
Exactly, and especially if it's, at the end of or past your Saturn return, you've had a full 30 years, which is the longest planetary period, and it is also, a full progressed lunar cycle period. So you've been around your cycle a full time to be able to engage with this Mars and know it a little bit. So we have at least this initial "I get you," and now, especially with Saturn having completed a return or just about to, because we do see Saturn is in Aquarius in this chart and
Yeah,
will be moving into Pisces on March 7th. So we've been around the block with this chart. We understand a little bit. Maybe we haven't consciously accessed Mars, but we tend to know what Mars does when Mars shows up. You might notice that you simmer and then boil over with your temper on occasion. You know that about yourself. You adapt to that, and you accommodate that in whatever way you need to because you've lived enough to do that. The chart's not saying, "Oh, you have to be this person." It's saying, "Hey, if this is you, I see
yeah,
you. It's there, but like look at how you've worked with that."
absolutely. And I love that we've just jumped into this Mars, which is perhaps which is undeniably the most
Mhm.
difficult planet in this chart. And I mean, Mars is coming up for this person, and we'll get to that in a
Mhm.
moment. But I love how we're like, Mars is stealing our attention here.
Yeah.
Um, should we start with, so we're getting a feel for the chart, right? Of just
Mhm.
like brass tacks who it is.
Mhm.
We know that it's a day chart. We see that the that Mars is also, why is my brain, yeah, I'm hurting. The sun is the ruler of the ascendant. Why, like,
Yeah, you had said earlier that Mars was. We got confused.
oh, I meant the
Mars is the
sun.
ruler of
I meant
sun.
the sun.
Yes.
And then I was
Yeah.
like doubting, and then I'm staring at myself like, do I just not know how to read charts? Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's a really, I'm like, that's a really powerful sun.
Yeah, the sun is the helmsman and exalted, quite happy. Yeah.
I was like, that Mars,
Mhm.
that would be a
Well,
whole conversation if that Mars was the ascendant ruler.
and the sun witnesses the ascendant by trine, which is also
Mhm.
really great, in his joy, as you mentioned. So the sun is strong, is really supported. The sun can do some things in this chart, especially being the ruler of the whole chart. So this is someone I imagine us also with this Leo rising and that Jupiter also there. Jupiter also in his own terms, if you notice.
Yeah.
This person probably has great hair. I'm just thinking of like Leo risings tend to have that lion's mane, like the
Yeah.
really cool. And you can speak to this, right?
Yeah. Spoiler alert, I'm Leo rising with Sun and Aries. So
So
I'm
is
like,
my
I know
husband.
that sun.
Yeah.
But I,
I'm just saying, and you prove it. So,
no, I'm thinking too, it's sometimes it's fun to think about, like when we're kind of talking about the chart for the first time, is like, there are going to be planets that are harder to deal with, but then also like, what are your superpowers? What is like
mhm.
your strength that you can go to?
Yeah. Yeah, I do this a lot with it's not traditional. This is the one thing that I use that really deviates from traditional, but I use it very regularly, and it's
Yeah.
because of how prominent it is in my chart. But when I'm working with people on their stories and
Yeah.
writing, we look at Chiron to see what your superpower might be. And it's interesting because obviously Chiron is in Cancer in this chart with the South Node, but also co present with that Mars that we were talking about earlier. So that Mars is probably going to be speaking a little bit to the superpowers, as you mentioned. Chiron is not even really an asteroid. It's like a comet, like a dead comet that's kind of become an asteroid.
Okay.
And Chiron is, if you know mythology, the wounded healer.
Yeah.
So Chiron in mythology is credited with creating pharmacy, which is neat, but also was the one who trained heroes. So we have this Chiron of I took what I went through and I alchemized it into a superpower. So now I can be a hero and help other people be heroes as well, using their strengths that may have appeared at first as a weakness. So to me, that also speaks to that whole debilitated planet thing, the way we were talking about before.
And if I could just meditate on this for a moment, right? Because I
Mhm.
often think that Mars in Cancer, if we think about Cancer, is where like it's emotional, like nurturing, right? It's a
Mhm.
space where we can like have vulnerable conversations, right? Like,
Mhm.
um, and Mars has a hard time because Mars wants to sever and cause war,
Mhm.
right? And so sometimes people with Mars in Cancer maybe dealt with like having those spaces of emotional vulnerability being
Mhm.
somehow like jeopardized,
Mhm.
perhaps. But interestingly enough, I've seen a lot of clients that have this Mars in Cancer signature that end up like I think it's Adam Ellenboss who first pointed this to me, and I've noticed it since. They can become like champions
Mhm.
for the Cancerian, whether they're like, I've seen a lot of like women's rights advocates or people who are working like defending children, right? So you can
Yep.
get that Mars can go from like having to deal with some difficulty to becoming like a champion, which is
Yep.
interesting to take the Chiron, because Chiron's story was that his parents rejected him, right? He was the centaur, and like his mother like was just like, hell no, like begged the gods to like, turn her into a linden tree essentially.
Mhm.
And so you have this like really kind centaur who like was pretty much abandoned as a child, but ended up like taking care of all these other children, right? And so there,
Mhm.
it feels like there are some interesting similarities between that Mars in Cancer and that Chiron in Cancer, even though I don't use Chiron that often myself.
Yeah. Yeah, and my use of Chiron, because we can't really associate a lot of essential dignity to it, or
Right.
say like how well is Chiron able to do what Chiron does. We just know Chiron does in this context.
Yeah,
So it's Chiron does the wounded healer in a Cancerian context. So I think your interpretation is probably the extent I would go to. I usually with Chiron especially will bring a lot of intuition into how that looks in the
absolutely.
chart, and as well taking into account the house topics and connections from other planets, or the ruler of Chiron, which again is going to be the moon. So
Mhm.
treating Chiron kind of the way you would with a lot, in a
Sure.
sense. Yeah.
And I think to your point, like we're talking about this chart anonymously right now, but
Hmm.
I think that if we had a client in front of us, this Chiron more than anything would be an opportunity for questions,
Hmm.
right? Like
Yeah,
where have you felt that? What was your childhood like? Was there emotional
exactly.
stability? Things like this.
Yeah, the beautiful thing about an actual consultation is you have the discussion, the back and forth, where the chart speaks to us, we translate the chart, and the person gets to validate it and expand upon it, clarify it, and then we can dig even deeper once we have that clarity to say, "Oh, so this is how that showed up for you." Now these other things, past, present, future, or personality, also are there, and now we can give even more insight, which is the beauty of astrology.
Absolutely. Before we go into the Saturn return, should we talk, because we're talking about
Yeah.
this Cancer Chiron, should we maybe give a little space to talk about the 12th house and how the house placement might affect it?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to preface with, though, is the 12th house in tradition is considered the house of the bad daimon, which is spelled Daimon or Daemon, which
Mhm.
looks a lot like demon. Not necessarily. There is also a house of good diamond, which is the 11th house. It
Yeah.
was just spirit. So we're looking at bad spirit, good spirit. And spirit could be a condition of illness or mentality, or joy versus melancholy, that kind of thing. So it's not something to immediately, especially for the person whose chart this is. If you're watching this, I'm not saying you're an insane person who belongs in an asylum when I talk about the 12th house often being a place of solitude, or being a place of self-undoing or hidden enemies. What that looks like in the context of metaphor, and when it shows up in real life, can sometimes mean that this person does end up in prison or whatever. But
Mhm.
also we notice that in a lot of cases, this can also mean, especially with the moon being the ruler of it and being near the midheaven, this person, even in public, may feel lonely. And so we have the context of the rest of the chart that you really want to draw into a actual interpretation of the sign, or the house. The house itself, the 12th house, is known as the place of hidden enemies, known as the place of isolation, incarceration, and illness. It's the stuff we can't see. Rick Levine actually had a really great way of describing the houses that aren't able to be seen from the ascendant or the cardinal points. So if you're looking at the chart and you do like the 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock houses,
Yeah.
those are your main points of activity. And then you have the signs that they can see, and then the ones that are in the blind spots.
Yeah.
So the same way that your car, you can see out the side windows, the front and the back, but you have your blind spots at the angles on either corner. That's the similar thing. Because we can't see it, we're not sure what it's doing until it becomes known. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when you're thinking about these houses that are called cadent. They don't have a lot of energy to them. So a lot of the times you won't notice what's going on because they don't have the charge in the battery the way other signs and houses offer. So that means that until something comes up to trigger something going on in this 12th house, we didn't see that there. But then you do, your BP thing goes off on the car and says your blind spot indicator has been pinged. That could be a transit, that could be, progression, or it could be a perfection that really lights that up. Um, Looking at this, we do see that the Time Lord is going to be Mars soon for this person. Currently, it's Jupiter. They're in a Pisces perfection, and then they will be in a ninth house perfection, which is going to activate Mars a little bit, which may bring up some of those topics.
May I add to the 12th house for a moment before we
Yeah.
get to that Mars? Just to give some context here too, I think it's important to realize perhaps one of the beauties of astrology is being able to see these blind points,
Mhm.
blind spots, if you will,
Yep.
right? And for those who, again, like to maybe add some, to build on some other associations of the 12th house, I'll offer a few here.
Mhm.
I really liked how Sam Reynolds said the padded room, right? It could
Mhm.
also be a recording studio, a place where you need to
Yes.
go, right? And I really, my favorite 12th house story that I think is worth inviting people in. Have you ever heard of Damien Eccles, the
Yeah.
magician? Yeah.
Mhm.
So he, at 19 years old, was, and get, crude summary here, everyone, essentially convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and was sentenced to life in prison at 19, right? That's an interesting nodal return. Anyway, so he tells the story in one of his books that um, he gets to prison, and this older inmate who had been there forever tells him the story the moment he gets there. And he said, listen, you have two options. You can either see these walls as keeping you in, and
Mhm.
it's a prison, and you're going to go crazy and lose yourself. Or you can think of these walls as keeping you safe so that you can go deep. And this is your sanctuary, your sort of ashram, right? Like monastery, if you will.
Mhm.
Right. And so he ended up devoting the next, like, I don't know, 15, 20 years of his life, as long as he eventually got out. But he ended up devoting his life to magic and really using it as that sort of sanctuary space. Right. And I
Mhm.
think that's the perfect description of the 12th house. It can feel like a prison, but it does also have these connotations of like sanctuary. These walls can keep you safe. Thus, the padded room where you go to record, where you go to write in silence. And the last sort of image that I'll offer is Gemini Brett. Like, if we think about what the 12th house is in our day, it's dawn,
Mhm.
right? It's this
Yeah.
idea that you can't see the forest for the trees. So there is this sense of solitude. Yes, sometimes those things that come up that we don't see them, but there can be a lot of beauty here. Again,
Mhm.
not like in this sort of modern, like this is going to be easy beauty, but it's
Mhm.
something to keep in mind.
Yeah, another cool thing for the cadent houses, which the 12th house
Mhm.
is one. Demetra George has been known to say this, and it's the Greek term is metacosmios,
Okay.
which is the liminal spaces, the space between spaces. And that's where a lot of magic and spiritual things happen. That's where form isn't required and you can still, it's malleable. You can create the form once you get into the more, the what is it, the angular house that follows. So this is something, the 12th house also is associated with pre-birth, who we
Mm.
are just before we're born, because it falls into that first house, which is, us and the way we greet the world and things like that.
Ah, yes, I love that. I love the between spaces. That really makes
Mhm.
a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, especially with Cancer being there. I feel like we're looking at maybe solitude being a safe space,
Hmm.
and really using that. Magic also gets placed in here.
Yeah.
Spirituality gets placed in here. In more modern times, we're noticing that self-undoing is something we can do consciously through like personal development. So
Yeah.
sometimes it can be very constructive and very intentional. And meditation is another way that you can access that unseen area or that metacosmios. So meditation often is now associated with the 12th house as well, because we're accessing it on purpose.
Absolutely.
And with the moon being there, that mental state of being able to sink into that, maybe a little bit more active meditation. We might have a bit of a busier meditation with Mars
Mhm.
being present, but it's something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And should we, because we will get to this in a moment, because as we talk a little bit about address some of their questions, but should we talk about Saturn return now?
Yeah, so let's dive into Saturn return, and then we can get to the specific question that was going on with this person. So, Saturn return, it's a 30-year cycle, give or
Mhm.
take,
Yep.
and we all will go through it at 30, at roughly 60, and again, you might get there again for a third. Some people do. That's pretty epic. Um, but so if you have Saturn in Aquarius in your natal chart,
Yes.
so Saturn with the squiggly blue lines next to it, then you are completing your Saturn return, which began around December 21st of the year 2020. So that's the span of your Saturn return. It might have gotten particularly tricky. If you have a night chart, if you were born at night, Saturn, as compared to Mars in this chart, Saturn is more of the difficult one in the chart. So it may have been more hard work getting through it, less like constructive support, depending
Mhm.
on the condition of Saturn in your chart otherwise. We know that Saturn in Aquarius is in his domicile. So that's actually a positive thing for Saturn. And then as Saturn approached the exact degree of your natal Saturn, that's when you would have gotten the culmination or the climax of the story of your Saturn return. And then from there, it may have been waning with you reacting to that. And trust me, as someone who is finishing the years immediately following Saturn return, you spend the next 3 years or so really processing and figuring out how that works in your favor.
Absolutely. And as someone who's who's finishing up a Saturn square right now,
Yeah.
that's also something to think about. So every 7 years after your Saturn return, you experience, depending on how prominent Saturn is in your chart, something called the Saturn square, which can be a
Mhm.
check into those themes.
Yep.
So something, something to keep in mind for people right now, or the Saturn opposition too, right? So
Mhm.
people who have Saturn in Leo, Saturn in Scorpio, Saturn in Taurus, you might be, some of these topics might be relevant to you too. You might have been
Mhm.
feeling sort of a bigger Saturn transit.
You may be noticing a throwback to your own Saturn return, getting kind of a plot point added to it for sure.
Crystalline, if you don't, I can't remember. Are you technically a day chart or a night chart?
I was born at moonrise and sunset, but so the sun had just set. I'm in the first hour of night, um, by a couple degrees. So
How was your, if you may ask, like, how was your, as a night sect, how was your Saturn return?
Saturn beat me up for but for good reasons. So what being an astrologer during the Saturn return, immediately you're like, okay, I'm gonna master this. I'm gonna do well with it. And I tried not to be that person, but in the attempt of denial for how hard things are at times, you tend to be like, well, I'm doing it this way, and I'm gonna be okay because I see it coming. And for me, I saw it coming, and I gave myself the grace to endure it, which is how I like to say like the best mentality you can have. Know that you're in a moment right now and let yourself have a moment. And know that it's not just a moment, it takes months, or sometimes it Saturn will station retrograde right on your natal degree like it did mine and just back up over you a couple times, which is fun. It was very hard. I was despondent at some moments of it, but knowing that there was another side and knowing that this was that moment helped me know it was passing, so it wasn't forever. And yeah, I had mentors who unconsciously and unintentionally really hurt my feelings. I gave up on what my life dream was at that time, alchemized it into something completely new, different, and incorporating passions that Saturn was niggling at me the whole time to start paying more attention to. So Saturn will tell you, put this down because I need you to pick this up. So Saturn does the I pick things up, I put them
Yeah.
down kind of thing.
I
Yeah.
Adding on to that, I think when we talk about Saturn return and sect, I think some people go, "Oh my God, like I have a day chart, I have a night, like I have a night chart." Like there's sort of this instant fear. But I think like it's interesting to point out that like how your Saturn works in the chart
Mhm.
I think it gives us indication about, like, how you Saturn, maybe how well you Saturn, maybe what
Mhm,
how like, maybe if you've avoided Saturn, because I have a day chart, so Saturn would be more constructive. I
mhm,
have Saturn in Scorpio, and so I was thinking, like, I had a doozy, right? Like, there was, like, a very prominent 4th house, so there's
mhm,
prominent themes of, like, death and things during my Saturn return, right? Not to f scare anyone. It ended up being
mhm.
very constructive after the integration, but I
Yeah,
think but to something though, the connection between our stories is I think Saturn return can teach you how to Saturn. Like,
yeah,
I had someone, like, almost come into my life, like, people were playing Saturn in these very strange ways, and so even though I have a day chart, it still felt like I think I'd been avoiding my Saturn for a very long time, and it's interesting to point out that you, well, have an up for debate chart, but do you mind sharing that you have Saturn in?
I have actually, to that point, your Saturn was really doing what it does, right? You have Saturn in Scorpio in the fourth
Yeah.
house, and it was showing you who it was. My Saturn is in Capricorn, so it has the resources it needs, and
Yep.
it's in the third house. So in places of people I was trying to learn from,
Yeah.
in writing, which was one of the things I had to put down, and on that axis, divination and or astrology were things that I picked up.
Yeah, and so it's nice to kind of know that it depends on, like, Saturn can teach you how to work with your Saturn,
Mhm.
and if you have Saturn in Scorpio in the 4th house, it doesn't mean that that's just, like, dead things.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
But, this is to keep, again, I think keeping in mind that, this person, right, this is a
Mhm.
fun conversation in a sense because everyone who's been experiencing the Saturn return has, like, Saturn in Aquarius, arguably what the, Saturn's favorite sign to be in?
It's Saturn's diurnal sign,
Yes.
and Saturn is of the day bisect as well.
Yes.
So, we would yeah, we could say that for sure.
Arguably, Saturn likes to be here
Mhm.
most,
Yeah.
right? We could say that.
Yeah, I'll give it that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So, if you may not have been experiencing the doozy of Saturn returns.
yeah. And actually, I have, my business partner, Emily, who does the Forgotten Storytellers and the Alchemist Inkwell stuff with me, um, has is completing her Saturn return,
Okay,
Saturn being in Aquarius. Um I won't give up more of her chart that
sure.
way, but it was definitely constructive, but it had her questioning a lot of things, and it had her grappling, I think is a good word, with a lot of ideals. Now we're thinking about Saturn in Aquarius. How is Saturn going to show you how Saturn in Aquarius goes? Aquarius is the big picture and the like high perspective, thinking about ideals and what's fair and how to make stuff work and how to make it work consistently and for a long period of time for multiple people. And that was definitely something that came up.
Absolutely. Um, it's also interesting to think about people who are going through their Saturn returns to some extent. I think of always end up being like the leaders of a moment, right? Like we see this signature that's been speaking very loudly for the
Mhm.
last 2 years.
Yeah.
But this is interesting because while we're touching a little bit upon, which you did so eloquently, what a Saturn return is,
Mhm.
this chart's interesting because we're actually touching on the question really is what comes after the Saturn
Yeah.
return?
Now what?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we're seeing now is Saturn's about to move into Pisces. And this is going to be the first time in about 6 years where Saturn is not going to be in domicile and is not going to have the dignity of being at home or even in exaltation or anything like that. So Saturn is journeying now. We're leaving home. We're going on an adventure, but more the Bilbo version than the Frodo version, I guess. We're not happy to be going out, but since we have to, here we go. And we're going straight into the primordial abyss of Pisces, which has the least amount of structure. So that's something Saturn's going to be showing, like, how do you bring form to the formless? Or, as a lot of metaphors have been used right now, how do you bring a solid to liquid? Or how do you put shape in the ocean? And one of the things I was actually thinking about with this, given some of the topics that are already coming up, is you put a solid in the ocean by building a ship, right? Saturn would build a boat to be able to navigate the ocean. However, it reminds me as well of how Pisces dissolves. So that
Yeah.
ship is going to be one thing when it sets out. It's going to be something different when it reaches its destination. And it reminded me of the ship of Theseus. Have you heard about this?
No, please tell me.
So it's a ship that's in a museum, but they've redone it so many times and fixed it and repaired it so many times that not a single plank is the original plank. And so people say, is it still the ship of Theseus? And that's something you have to grapple with. It's still the 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 container, it's still the ship because it was, but if everything's been replaced, is that still the ship of Theseus? And I think we're noticing this with a trend coming in of traditions, particularly in magic, in methods, in astrology. I've seen it in a lot of mystery schools and things like that, and just traditional ways of thinking and being. We're seeing that is growing and evolving, and there's a push for it to evolve. And we're saying, how do we honor where it came from? Do we let the ship of Theseus be the ship of Theseus? And the way I explained it to my husband earlier today was like,
Yeah.
if you have your grandmother's cookie recipe, but over time you end up using completely different ingredients, it's still a cookie. But is it your grandmother's cookie? And does it matter?
And you know, that's really beautiful. And like on the personal level, right? We think that we spent 2 years with Saturn and Capricorn, Saturn and Aquarius, and to some extent, there's this idea that we know how to Saturn. We know what the
Mhm.
structures are, we know what the containers are, right? Like we've been through some things, like we get this. And then suddenly Saturn in Pisces is like, but wait, you mean like
Yeah.
it's all changing materials on me?
Yeah.
Like it's almost, yeah, like
It's
there's
like,
this,
you know how to dance, but do you know how to disco? And so it's this whole different thing.
oh God, now it's time to underwater disco,
Yeah.
which I think wow. I want to. I'm gonna stick to the ship of Theseus because that's brilliant. I'm
Yeah.
not gonna take my other underwater metaphors, but it does. It feels like we're just taking the deep dive,
Mhm.
right? Like literally Saturn from an air sign to like just like okay, now we're just literally like over our heads with water.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely in over our heads. And Saturn, of course, the metal that is associated with Saturn is lead.
It's
So you think about what Saturn's gonna do. I don't know if we're gonna swim, we're gonna sink, and we're gonna trudge our entire way across that ocean floor until we get to the next beach. So it's just that kind of like, if this is what I'm in, I'm just going to put one foot in front of the other until I get back to somewhere I want to be, but I'll go through it. So if you have Saturn in Pisces and you're coming upon your Saturn return, these might be some familiar sounding themes to you that you've already kind of previewed in your life a little bit. Maybe that's a character trait that you're recognizing in yourself in these metaphors. But also, if you're finishing your Saturn return, this is the time where your Saturn is not going to see your natal Saturn. Transiting Saturn will not be interacting with your natal Saturn. So you have this blind spot moment to be like, whoa, that happened,
Right.
and really process it. So those are my two big things that I've been saying to people as we're preparing for this transition of Saturn.
Something really interesting to think about. We've mentioned this too. That for those who are like the alarm. By the way, I just want to say the the sort of motto for Saturn and Pisces is now sink and swim.
Yep.
That for sure. But for
For
anyone who's
learning.
sort of getting alarmed, like this sounds scary, I think it's very important to notice that we've already sort of felt the tide come in. Like
Mhm.
I don't know about you, but people who have Saturn and Pisces have been like coming to the fore of the media. They've been like these stories have been coming up for review already. Like we're kind of already dipping our toes in it. And maybe I'm gonna. So with that, Crystalline, I'm gonna ask you, how would you describe Saturn and Pisces as a signature, and what we can maybe expect culturally?
Yeah, so culturally, I've mentioned this before, and I've again, I'm starting to see it already happening, where I think we're going to be taking things that don't have form or don't have standard
Yeah.
yet, and we're going to be saying, how do we know this is the trustworthy version of this? How do we know we can put our trust in this? What can you show me that makes me understand this magic? Like, how can you show me that you're experienced and that I can trust you, whether it's experienced because I'm old and I've done it for a long period of time, or because I'm gifted and I'm really talented with it, or however that's going to look. I think it's important that a lot of us are saying, like, here's how I can show you that this connection we're making, or that this method or this system, psychology is probably going to get a lot more recognition. I imagine diagnoses are going to be more accessible and common. at this time. And I think that that's really going to push us to say, okay, now how do we actually accommodate this? We don't have a system in place yet. We don't have a structure to support this. How do we build the structures to support that which can't be seen and is pretty fluid and, is a spectrum, to quote, certain neurodivergence,
Sure.
which I subscribe to. So it's going to be saying, like, how do we honor that there isn't necessarily a shape and a form, but we still need to be able to see and understand this person, and we still need to be able to accept and accommodate this, whatever it is, into society. Society in and of itself is something shapeless and formless, but we always are trying to put structure to it. So I think that's going to be really interesting to watch us go through Pisces, which is a peaceful, tranquil, very floaty place, and to come through and say, how do we try to capture this? How do you put lightning in a bottle and say that this is something I can see and work with?
Absolutely. And I think on the personal level, it's interesting. A lot of people I know who have Saturn and Pisces, I think of I think of periods, right? Like
Mhm.
the grunge period, right?
Yeah.
Like I think of sad, witty comedians.
Mhm.
Um, also the Pillsbury Doughboy, giving
Yep.
form to the formless. Just
Yeah.
love putting that one out.
Video games are a Saturn and Pisces thing.
Huh?
Video games are a
Yeah.
Saturn and Pisces thing.
So we see this kind of like the place where the form meets the formless. Sometimes there's tension, and sometimes that there is some pain there, right? Sometimes that Saturn and Pisces can bring up depression. So I like that you pointed out the the sort of psychology, mental health world, like to dig into
Mhm.
that. But I think it's also important to people who have certain placements might realize this sort of thawing as the frigid
Yeah.
air of Aquarius like lends to the water of Pisces, it might bring up some feels, some depression in people, and that's something to be aware of.
Yeah. Processing of the grief of what we've all been through collectively over the last 6
Absolutely.
years, I think is gonna be a big thing, 'cause, we've been running so hard and so fast and just trying to figure out what new normal is and all this other stuff, and then we were a little bit kind of like, "Okay, how do we reform society for this?" Which would have been the Aquarius, right? And now we're like, "Okay, how do we actually deal with the feelings of what we've been through? How do we feel this, and how do we hold space for that?" And then even on a society level, another thing I'm looking at is we
Mhm.
have AI. How do we, create a responsible functioning thing that seems to be emerging? What is consciousness? I think is going to be another question that we start. I don't think we're going to finish and answer that
Yeah,
question in 3 years, but I think it's going to be something where something emerges, and over the next 30 years we see how that goes until the next Saturn and Pisces.
absolutely. By the way, will you check the comments because there
Yeah,
is a
the Lord of the Rings
there's
comment.
a Lord of the Rings reference, and I'm gonna be honest, I don't always get Lord of the Rings references. So
So earlier when I mentioned that, it's more Bilbo, that's the
yeah.
Hobbit. Uh, Frodo was Lord of the Rings. So don't worry, I got you. I got you. Yeah.
So wait, which one did like wait, hold on, let me get this.
Frodo didn't wanna go.
That was Lord of the Rings.
Well, no, Frodo did wanna go. Frodo was kind of like ready for more adventure. Bilbo originally was really peeved at everybody being at his house, and then had to work himself up to say, "I'm going on an adventure," and, really convince himself that that was exciting.
They're all like one
Yeah,
thing. This is so embarrassing. I'm gonna be like canceled by like
yeah.
Lord of the Rings.
Everybody came from the Shire. It's just a matter of how excited they were to leave.
Love it. Thank you. Sorry, I got derailed. I'm like, ooh, good comment.
Yep.
Woo. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Fantasy stories are a big thing for, Saturn and Pisces as well. In fact, I think The Hobbit might have been a Saturn and Pisces thing. So this is quite appropriate. I have to look that up and confirm it, but I know a lot of video games and a lot of high fantasy stories. Again, you're bringing structure to the magic systems and things like that. It's pretty cool.
absolutely. Thank you for covering that. And also, case in point, we're bringing up the God, when was The Hobbit first written? Now I want to okay, but that's a
I'm
side.
gonna Google it. It's
You
fine.
Google it. Like, I want to know this now. Hey, while you Google that, I will say so we are looking at this.
1937.
Okay, what was happening there?
I don't know. Let me grab the ephemeris.
Yeah, the ephemeris. Okay.
Actually, this starts in 1950, so I'm actually going to use Luna for the ephemeris there. So,
Okay. Want to take a moment? Could we have like an unsponsored commercial break and you tell us a bit about Luna?
oh, sure. So Luna is a web-based program. I use a couple different astrology programs.
Yeah.
Astro Gold is where I got this chart. Luna, I use a lot. It does some really cool stuff. It's not up on the Hellenistic stuff yet, but Kevin, who runs Luna, and I met
Yeah.
at Utsar and Norwalk, is delightful, and is working on it. And I'm actually helping with that when the opportunity comes up. I do like I'm eager and ready, and have been invited to help contribute to that. So what I'm doing, Luna has an online ephemeris, which is
Yeah.
really easy for me to navigate. So I'm just going to do September 1937, and I'll just pick a day, September, I think it was 21st, which is interesting. Let's start at the beginning of September, actually.
And by the way, we would probably not, if there was a client in front of us, we would ask way more questions. We may not stop to have a whole side conversation about The Hobbit
Mhm. Yeah,
unless the other party was thoroughly engaged.
exactly. Yeah, and if it were relevant to help explain, like, this is again the analogy of it. Yeah, 21st September. Thank you, Jill. Which is again 21st September. Isn't that that's the not it's the equinox, isn't it? Roughly. So 9/21, 1937.
Jill's so good.
Yeah,
I hope Jill had that memorized. I hope Jill's like a walking, like,
Lord of the Rings expert.
Lord of the Rings.
Jill, you might be interested in Becca Tarnas, who is a walking Lord of the Rings expert and a very amazing archetypal astrologer. So we had
100.
Saturn in Aries at that time. So this is going to be really, it's going to have its Saturn return right after the conjunction between Saturn and Neptune in that first degree of Aries.
You know, and this is a really great dovetail.
But that means he was writing it during Saturn and Pisces. Just saying.
Yes, because this is the dovetail. I think that a lot of times we're just like, party's over, like my Saturn return's done. But I think in some ways, looking back at my clients, my own real life experience, that in a sense, the work begins after the Saturn return. Because Saturn return, you're figuring this shit out, you're learning how to ride the bike, that is your Saturn. There we go. So let's jump into this.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, in a story, you have your scenes and your sequels where there's action and then there's reaction. So if you're in your Saturn return, you're in the scene. You're in the action. But then you have the sequel to the scene or the reaction to the scene. There's always the battle and then the wow, what just happened? What do we do with that now? How do we prepare for moving on? And this is exactly what the chart does as well. You have your angular, the action. You have the succeedent, what just happened? The cadent, how do we prepare for what's coming next? And then the action again. So it's really beautiful. But I agree, we should jump into the chart here a little bit more.
So this person was essentially that they were wondering what I think their biggest fear. They're like, what do I expect after my Saturn return? And they were wondering if they should have to wait 2 years before buying a house because Saturn's going to their 8th house of shared resources. Also, if I can share a little bit just anonymously about this individual, it feels like they're set to tell a little bit about their Saturn return itself. It feels like it had a lot to do with significant one-on-one relationships. There was some family stuff that came to the fore, right? I think it had to do with they had to rethink the way that they did their life. A lot of it dealing with maybe a upbringing that was religious that they were kind of starting to rethink about, which feels like a very 9th house topic, and we'll come to that in a moment. But I think this emphasis that the way that this person said was that there was a lot of significant boundaries around one-on-one relationships, and I'll let you carry on from there.
Yeah, so we have Saturn in the 7th, so we know we're going to be setting boundaries between us and them.
Yep.
And that's something to really think about. And they're also going to be based, likely they could be things that are based on ideals or not necessarily worldviews, but I could see how politics and religion might come into this whole Aquarian theme of what's fair, what's right, what do I believe, and how do my ethics inform the way I act in the world, and how do they get along with other people's? How do we fit as a group? Where do I fit in the group? But also keeping in mind that when we dig just a little bit deeper, we notice that this person is going out of their current perfection of an 8th house perfection and into the 9th house, which I think you were going to bring up. So I'm already thinking about that a little bit for them since their birthday's coming up in April. And just noticing there's a couple things that really stand out. First and foremost, noticing that the birthday is coming up in April and recognizing that birthday is going to bring a 9th house year where Saturn will already be in Pisces. So we're looking at this is starting their new year for them. We're already wrapping up the 8th house year. And
Mhm.
what Jupiter having been in there, it may not have been too chaotic because
Yes.
Jupiter was in domicile for a lot of it, but now Jupiter's in Aries and will move around May 12th into the 10th house. So we're going to have a lot of abundance of attention or of opportunity for movement in life direction and life path or career movement. But in the ninth house year, there may be some dealings with politics and religion again, because the ninth house really does cover worldview.
Absolutely.
The ninth house also governs astrology, which is really cool. You know, your higher forms of learning, of pursuit of spirituality, that kind of stuff, how you really anchor it and practice it. And the sun and Mercury, of course, are there. Mercury is the astrologer of the zodiac as well, as far as planets go. So that's something
Yes.
to keep in mind. This is the active house. So these two are going to be active because their house is lit up. And Mars is going to be playing into that as well, particularly the movement of Mars throughout the year. And Mars
Mhm.
is finally going to be getting out of this person's 11th house and coming back to the 12th house during March as well. So this person's going through a Mars return. So we're going to learn a little bit about how we Mars um, from this. And so we've been seeing some situations with friends, possibly family, depending on how close our relationships are, that have been under construction and
Yeah.
under review with Mars since about August 20th of last year, when Mars came into Gemini and then just stayed there for a good long time, retrograding between October 30th and January 12th. So
Yes.
there may have been some conflict going on with relations between people. Again, we're seeing that because Gemini is that one-on-one, that communication, that connection.
Absolutely. And may I add into that real quick? May
Yeah,
I? Go
before
ahead.
I
Yeah.
jump onto Venus here.
And I think it's interesting. It almost feels like you said that Mars feels like a preview period, because I
Mhm,
think the thing to remember is that it feels like overall this person made it sound like this, from what we understand, this was a constructive Saturn return. They feel like they have a good handle on it.
mhm,
But thinking that for the last year, Jupiter has been the time lord.
mhm,
And Jupiter is in a very good place in their chart, a place to
mhm,
help them. It's in the first house. Jupiter is part of the day sect. It's the insect benefic. So Jupiter wants to help, right?
mhm.
And so it's interesting to think, though, that they're moving from that Jupiter time lord, to
Yeah,
Mars,
Mars.
where Mars is a tricky planet in their chart, right?
Mhm.
Mars is the um,
Out of
out
sect.
of stacked malefic. I was thank you so much. It's like we mentioned at the very beginning that Mars might have some struggles. And
Mhm,
maybe that Mars can be quiet in their life, but that Mars might be kind of louder this year. And so we
mhm,
think about ideas of ninth house topics and almost coming back to maybe the lessons of the Saturn return of having to draw boundaries and having to think about what's important to them. It feels like those things are really going to come to the fore. Like,
mhm.
what do I believe in? What's important to me? And so that sense of like integration that we talked about with that Saturn and Pisces feels like it could be mimicked with having to deal with a little bit of those more difficult Mars issues as well.
Mhm. Well, and there's gonna be, the Mars-Saturn trine. So Mars being activated is going to trine Saturn, so we're gonna bring Saturn into some sort of awareness for us there.
Yes.
But Mars, again, Mars is returning, and in the solar return chart, if I draw up the chart for this person's birthday this year,
Yeah.
and just say, you know, how's Mars doing? How Marsy can we get? Is Mars able to be active about it? Because to your point about Jupiter having been in Pisces for that period of time, Jupiter was in domicile, but also in the house that was activated. So
Yeah.
this person, would have been able to be actively involved in those
Mhm.
topics because
Yeah.
Jupiter was in place. Um, Jupiter at the time could not witness himself in the natal chart, so it
Wow.
may not have been as much of a comfort zone. There may have been some actual effort that this took, but it was just this instinctual, I've got to do this. I know what I have to do. It's
Yeah.
maybe a little bit out of character, but it feels empowered. And it
Mhm.
feels like maybe there's like a divine wind helping out with this, with that Pisces spirituality that Jupiter can offer, some divine insight. Then Jupiter came into Aries. I think Jupiter came into Aries officially back in like October and stayed. So this really lit up that ninth house, started those themes for us because Jupiter is the time lord. And now
Yeah.
it's in the next house that's going to be lit up and is going to pass that torch, still being in that house, is going to pass the torch to Mars, who is his ruler, just as he comes to conjoin the natal sun and Mercury. So we have this like really cool, ambitious, good stuff happening, but there's this hint of we have to process this. We have to deal with it. Mars in the solar return chart is in the natal position of Mars. So we're feeling familiar with this at
Mhm.
least. And Mars actually witnesses the sign that's activated. It can witness the ninth house here from the natal position and from the solar return position. So we're going to be more actively involved in these ninth house topics probably for the year. And ebbing and flowing as Mars progresses throughout the other signs throughout the year. But that does give us the whole like I'm in my power. I nurture myself. I'm the hero I needed, and I've become that person a little bit. Um, and so those themes of the ninth house of foreign travel or higher education and learning, worldview, religion, all of those things, that's going to be an active choice, active, emphasized even more by Mars, doing what Mars does.
Absolutely. And it's important to realize that Mars does rule the fourth house of home, family, but
Hmm.
also ancestry, right? So I
Yep.
think in some ways, if this person has been dealing with some um, severing of certain familial relationships, I think this like that struggle, as you will, to
Hmm.
get to that solar place
Hmm.
might having to be confront those hidden Mars. Like, who is that Mars? Is the Mars the whole hidden belief system or things you've always sort of taken for granted,
Hmm.
right? Especially if you start to come into astrology and you came from like a sort of more dogmatic background, right? These
Hmm.
could be some, this could be a little this path to greatness could be a little painful at moments, and I
Yeah.
think that's maybe something that might come up.
Yeah. And one of the things we were talking about, is this going to prevent me from buying a house for the next 2 years? I don't necessarily think so. I think the move might be somewhere further. I think also noticing that the nodes and the eclipses are coming into this active axis as
Yeah.
well, that we may have some quick decisions that happen
Mm,
around the eclipses, the first of which is going to be in April. And then that one actually is happening in Aries. So I
yeah.
think it's like April 21st or something like that. So right after Mars takes over as Time Lord, we have this first eclipse happening in Aries. And then we'll start this process of the eclipses happening on the Aries Libra axis. But I don't think necessarily it means you don't buy a house in the next 2 years. But I think, as we mentioned when we were going over this a little bit beforehand, I would not pass up on an inspection of a house I decide to purchase because Mars is in that 12th house of unseen things. So making sure that the structure is sturdy, that there's no leaks or
Hitting
there's
off.
no termites or anything like that, that the pipes, the water pipes, especially Mars being in Cancer,
Yeah.
that the water access is what it should be and quality is what it should be. Just keeping those things in mind, make sure your plumbing is taken care of. Just if they offer an inspection, I wouldn't even say if they offer, I would say request the inspection because that's part of a house process anyway. Um,
I would
keeping
actually,
those
adding on
in
to
mind.
that, I would say that the next 2 years could actually be, again, depending on the housing market. I'm not telling anyone to make decisions, but
Yeah.
with Saturn the eighth of joint resources, right?
Hmm.
Like, while I would definitely be careful of, to your point, hitting costs, Saturn is out of reach of the ruler of it's not in a place to harm the ruler of the second house of resources. Um,
Hmm.
and
Or
so,
the of the eighth house, to be fair.
yeah, huh?
It doesn't harm the ruler of the eighth house either, of shared resources or of loans.
Absolutely, yeah. Or the second.
Hmm.
Yes. So it, I would say, as long as you're not, I wouldn't buy a house during eclipse season. I would
Hmm.
keep the nodes away from the sun
Hmm.
and Mercury, ideally. But and this is where I would consult an astrologer to really dig in and find a good time to buy. But if you wait the next 2 years, then Saturn moves on top of Mercury, becomes co-present with Mercury in a difficult place, which could make buying a house even harder, right? If the Saturn becomes co-present with the ruler of the second house. So to answer this person's question, I would think that there could be a time in the next 2 years that you could take the risk on, right? Especially if you're buying it with your partner. But I would consult an astrologer to make sure of the exact timing.
Um, and as we're kind of winding down here,
Are you about to do the
I'm
same thing I am?
sorry.
Are you about to do the same thing I am?
Yes, I'm putting it in the comments so people can copy and paste if they need to. Uh, if I can spell consultation correctly. Um, yeah. So something to keep in mind is this person that we chose their chart
Yeah.
is going to get a discount code. We'll email it to them.
Okay.
Um, nice. But what we're going to do is they're going to get a free consultation with one or both of us. And anybody who's watching this right now, you can notice the code right down at, it's actually a banner on the video right now, and it's in the comments here. You can also get a discount on a reading with either of us. I think it's like 10% discount.
It is.
So
And I'm laughing, Crystalline, because I'm so budget. I'm like, look, can we just see my piece of paper?
yeah, I was going to do it with my I Love Corgis thing. To the person who just asked about Saturn being in the 7th, we're talking about transiting Saturn. So Saturn by transit is about to move out of this person's 7th house and into the 8th, which is why we were having a conversation about the 8th house.
I love it. We could go on forever. Do we think, but we are coming up to time here.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Crystalline, that we want to wrap this up with?
No, I think everything we set out to do, we accomplished according to our own Saturnian structures that we had in place. Go us. I'm very excited about that. Now, keep in mind at the next turn of the season, so when Aries season is upon us, we will do this again. So if you have questions and you want your chart to have the opportunity to be featured, you can email us at it's askmeastros@gmail.com.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So you can email us your questions there. When the time comes, we will choose a chart and we will do this all again with a new chart, a new question, and new transits to really discuss for what's coming up. So we hope that this has been relevant to all of you. We hope this has been useful and tangibly productive and applicable to the person who owns this chart and embodies this chart beautifully. And we appreciate all of you having been here. Feel free to share about this with any of your friends. Follow us on social media so you can stay up to date, because sometimes the sun will move. It's not always on the 21st, but the sun will move into a new sign. So we'll keep you updated on social media as to when the next live broadcast will be.
And to follow us on social media, you are the real Crystalline.
At the real Crystalline. No double L's, no underscores, anything like that. The real Crystalline, the way it is spelled right here. That's it, I promise you.
And my name is Stevie Henriette, and you can find me at Art of the Zodiac right there. All underscores on IG. And I shamelessly, besides doing this, I'm a consulting astrologer, but I also interview artists and astrologers. So please follow me on IG to find my podcast and IG live series. I have a really cool one coming up this Sunday with one of my favorite jewelry designers, White Wolf Syndicate.
Yes.
So follow me for all of my talks. And what do you have coming up, Crystalline?
So I am also a consulting astrologer. You can actually hire me to be your personal astrologer, and we can geek out and unfold your transits over time, which is super fun. And I also do the Alchemist Inkwell podcast, which is a more spiritually geared with a little bit of astrology sometimes thrown in because I can't help myself. So you can check that out as well with myself and Emily Dexter, who is a gifted and talented psychic medium as well. And I'm going to be speaking at Convocation in like a week from today in Detroit. So if you want to be there and hear how magic and writing work together with astrology, because I can't help myself, go ahead and grab a ticket for that. And I'll be there with CV, so you can actually meet both of us in person.
And I'm sure we'll do an IG live from there too. So check that out.
Yeah. Cool.
Fantastic. And guess what? I'm going to run off to my session now. With
Me
Larry.
too.
Yay! Have a beautiful day, friends, and thank you. Bye.
See you all later.
If I can get out of here.
I gotcha.